This is the continuation of part 3 of the platform walkthrough. This video is shorter than the previous one, but that does not make it less important. I had to split this specific part because the video tool only allows a maximum duration of 30 minutes. So we continue here directly from the same EA breakdown section inside the robot failure diagnosis layer. In the previous part, we started looking at how the tool identifies failure pressure inside the robot basket. Now we continue deeper into the same table where the framework starts translating those failure profiles into real action buckets. And as the table continues, the workflow starts separating the portfolio into completely different institutional action buckets. At the top, we still see large clusters sitting inside institutional reject classifications. These are robots the framework considers structurally unsafe for serious capital deployment. Not because of one bad metric alone, but because multiple layers collapse at the same time. Weak return to drawdown structure, poor profit factor, negative expectancy behavior, heavy underwater pressure, or dangerous instability profiles. And once several of those pressures combine together, the workflow moves from caution into outright rejection logic. That is why many of these robots receive actions like remove from live, no capital allocation, or complete structural rejection. But lower in the table, the workflow starts identifying a second category: robots that are not fully rejected but still require controlled monitoring. These profiles may still show profitability, acceptable recovery structure, or usable edge quality, but the overall structural balance is not yet stable enough for aggressive sizing. So instead of immediate rejection, the workflow shifts into controlled observation logic. Small test size, watch only, controlled monitoring. And then finally, near the healthier side of the table, we begin seeing robots classified under minor weakness profiles. These are no longer viewed as structurally dangerous. Instead, they show manageable weaknesses that can remain under observation while the portfolio continues evolving. So the robot failure diagnosis layer is not simply labeling robots as good or bad. It is building a full institutional decision hierarchy. Which robots must be removed? Which robots require monitoring? Which robots remain structurally acceptable? And which parts of the portfolio still deserve controlled capital exposure? And as the workflow continues deeper into the table, another important structural separation begins to appear. Not every weak robot is dangerous for the same reason. Some robots become classified as pure damage sources. These are systems contributing negative expectancy, negative return to drawdown structure, high underwater pressure, or direct portfolio instability. And because of that, the workflow starts measuring actual damage contribution share across the portfolio itself. Which means the framework is no longer only asking, is this robot weak? It is asking, how much structural pain is this robot injecting into the entire ecosystem? That is why some robots show elevated damage share percentages, high underwater duration, poor return to drawdown balance, and persistent instability signatures at the same time. But lower in the workflow, another category starts appearing. Profit carriers. These robots are no longer acting as structural damage sources. Instead, they become the systems carrying large parts of the portfolio's positive performance. However, the workflow still does not blindly trust profitability alone. Even profitable robots continue being stress tested through underwater duration, drawdown structure, trade count stability, outlier dependency, and concentration dominance. Because a robot can still produce strong profits while remaining structurally fragile underneath. And this is where the institutional logic becomes much more important. The workflow is no longer trying to find perfect robots. It is trying to identify which systems damage the portfolio, which systems carry the portfolio, which systems remain stable under pressure, and which systems only survive because of isolated performance spikes. So by the end of the robot failure diagnosis layer, the framework is no longer analyzing robots individually. It is mapping the structural behavior of the entire portfolio ecosystem as one connected institutional structure. Now we move into the full failure diagnosis reason detail table. And this is where the workflow stops speaking in broad portfolio language and starts exposing the exact structural identity behind every weak robot. Because at this stage, the framework is no longer simply saying a robot is dangerous. It is explaining exactly why. At the top of the table, we immediately see clusters of robots sitting at maximum failure pressure. Failure score 100, extreme severity, kill bucket classifications, critical health conditions, and full institutional reject verdicts. These are no longer viewed as unstable systems that merely need improvement. They are viewed as structurally broken profiles. The workflow identifies that the underlying architecture behind these robots is too weak for serious capital exposure. Some fail because of critical health deterioration. Others fail because of weak edge quality. Some collapse under streak pressure. Others become dangerously dependent on isolated outlier trades. And that distinction matters, because two robots can both lose institutional trust while failing for completely different structural reasons underneath. As the workflow continues lower into the table, the severity profile slowly begins changing. The framework starts moving away from full rejection logic and into controlled monitoring classifications. These robots are no longer considered completely broken, but they still contain meaningful structural pressure. Some remain psychologically heavy. Some suffer from unsafe profit carry behavior. Others still show dangerous streak dependency or unstable recovery balance. So instead of institutional rejection, the workflow shifts into observation logic. Needs controlled monitoring? Watch sizing carefully. Remain under structured observation. Then the table continues into the recommended action and diagnosis reason section. And this is where the failure layer becomes much more practical. Because now the framework is not only saying this robot has a problem, it starts translating the diagnosis into a direct action. So for the weakest profiles, we see actions like remove from live or no capital allocation. And the diagnosis reason explains why that action is being triggered. For example, the robot may already be classified as kill, the health score may be critically low, the sample may still be too weak, the robot may be net negative, profit factor can be below 1, expected payoff can be negative, SQN can be structurally weak, return over drawdown can be poor, or the robot can be a portfolio damage source. So, this part is basically the explanation behind the rejection. It shows that the tool is not rejecting a robot because of one single number. It is combining multiple failure signals together. Then lower in the same section, we start seeing more balanced action logic. Not every robot is rejected. Some robots move into watch only, small test size, or controlled monitoring. That means the robot still has pressure, but the tool does not see it as a complete structural reject. And at the healthier end, some robots can remain under observation. So this part is really important because it turns the failure diagnosis into something usable. It tells you which robots should be removed, which robots should only be watched with small sizing, and which robots still have minor weaknesses but can stay under observation. And with that, we reach the end of step 2. And honestly, this was already one of the most important parts of the entire workflow, because this layer is no longer looking at the portfolio from a surface-level perspective. It starts exposing the actual structural behavior behind the robots themselves. You begin seeing which systems create pressure, which systems damage survival, which systems depend too heavily on isolated winners, which systems struggle psychologically under stress, and which systems are structurally stable enough to keep carrying capital. And this is really important to understand. Because just because a robot shows red pressure somewhere does not automatically mean the robot is bad. That is one of the biggest mistakes people make. For example, I already know there are robots inside this portfolio that naturally depend on larger breakout moves or stronger trend expansions. That is part of their structural identity. Some systems lose slowly during compression, and then recover aggressively during trend expansion. Others survive mainly through asymmetric winners. That does not instantly make them bad systems. And this is exactly why these tools were never designed as click once, read one number, and blindly remove robots. No, the entire purpose of this framework is learning how to deeply understand what you are actually trading. Every tool inside this ecosystem is built around the same philosophy. Look deeper. Look deeper into your portfolio. Look deeper into stress behavior. Look deeper into structural pressure. Look deeper into survival characteristics. Look deeper into pattern behavior. That is why Monte Carlo exists. That is why the structural layers exist. That is why the concentration systems exist. That is why the failure diagnosis exists, not to replace thinking, but to help you see faster, deeper, and more clearly. Because at the end of the day, the real edge is not blindly following a tool. The real edge is learning how to recognize structure with your own eyes, learning what healthy behavior looks like, learning what dangerous deviations look like, learning when patterns begin changing underneath the surface. And when patterns start shifting, you become more alert. That is how real portfolio awareness is built. No guru, no coach, and no expensive course can fully teach that for you. Because eventually, you need to learn how to observe your own systems yourself. And that is the real goal behind this entire workflow. So this was step 2, and honestly, this was only the beginning of the deeper structural analysis. Because in the next step, we move into the cleanup plan layer, where the workflow starts transforming all of this structural pressure into direct portfolio action.